This video contains manga spoilers for all of Chainsaw Man Part 1 and up to chapter 230 of Jujutsu Kaisen. You have been warned. Ryomen Sukuna, Jujutsu Kaisen's primary antagonist and contender for the absolute strongest character in the entire series. Makima, the horseman of conquest who stops at nothing to achieve her vision of a perfect world. Lots of people have paired up characters from Jujutsu Kaisen and Chainsaw Man for versus battles here on YouTube. I've seen videos on Makima versus Gojo, Sukuna versus the Gun Devil, but I don't think I've ever seen someone tackle Sukuna versus Makima, both of which are the main antagonists of their respective series. So I decided to determine which of these monsters would come out on top if they ever had the opportunity to face one another. Sit back and allow me to explain to you why Sukuna versus Makima is not close. Let's start off by explaining each character's abilities, strengths, weaknesses, etc. before we dive into the actual fight. First, we'll talk about Makima. The extent of Makima's abilities and the specifics of certain abilities do have a bit of an unknown factor to them, so of course I'll only be using the abilities that we either see or hear of in the series. Physical stats. Makima's strength is surprisingly high. She was able to puncture Denshita's body and tear off his limbs with her bare hands, showing that she has fairly superhuman strength, but we aren't sure to what extent. Her hand-to-hand combat is also not bad, being able to straight up beat Denshita in a close quarters fight. However, her speed seems relatively unimpressive as she gets blitzed by Pochita and has no real speed feats throughout the entire story. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that her speed is relatively, I guess, human level or maybe superhuman level, but not too crazy, nothing too out of hand. Her durability also seems lackluster, as most attacks that hit her seem to do massive damage. But even though she breaks easily, she has an ability I'll explain later that counteracts that weakness. So her physical stats aren't bad, but could definitely be better. But Makima's real strength comes in the amount of hacks she has, aka the amount of devils, humans, or hybrids she has control over, plus some abilities of her own. Let's start with Makima's primary ability that comes with her horseman title. Her domination ability. Makima can take complete control over any living thing that she sees herself as superior than, which usually means being able to defeat them in a fight or something along those lines. So if she can't defeat something, she can't control it. Very important detail. Makima has used this ability to take control of a ton of things throughout the series, so let's get into the ones that we either see her use or hear that she has. The first ability we see is thought to come from a devil that she has a contract with, though we aren't sure which is actually the case for a lot of her abilities, to be honest. She showcases the ability to create large blasts powerful enough to completely obliterate even the bodies of fiends when she points her finger and utters the word bang. Pretty powerful and self-explanatory ability here, and it could potentially play a big role in her damage output in this fight. It seems to be strong, and we'll talk about it more later when we get to the fight, so let's move on. Next up is her Shrine Sacrifice ability. The ability to completely crush / demolish, whatever you want to call it, someone of your choosing via another person saying that person's name and also dying themselves as the sacrifice. A bit confusing, but if you've seen Chainsaw Man, then you know how it works. The problem with this ability is that it doesn't seem to be able to kill just anyone, as she didn't use it to kill powerful people that were coming after Denji, such as Santa Claus, Quan Chi, and her fiends, or even Reze. And she did in fact want these people dead. It's not like she held back on killing them to push her agenda like she did back in the Katana Man arc when she spared Akane and Katana Man. She ended up killing all of those people that I mentioned anyway, and I imagine if she could have used this ability, it would have been easier to do so. So unless we ever get the specifics of this ability, and it states that this ability ignores durability, it can kill literally anybody, I think it's pretty safe to assume that this ability isn't that broken and can't just fucking kill literally anybody she wants no matter how powerful they are. I think that's a bit far-fetched to assume. Next, force manipulation. She is able to generate an imaginary force that assumedly attacks one's head or brain or something like that, causing either significant damage or straight up death. Example 1 is in chapter 33, where she uses it to kill a whole house of Yakuza members, and as we see in the anime, she also extends this to Yakuza members outside of the house, so it can be used at like a pretty large distance, it seems. Example 2 is in chapter 66, where she uses it to deal damage to an extremely powerful primordial devil, which is an extremely impressive feat. So this seems like a pretty powerful offensive ability, which would definitely be useful in this fight. Again, we'll talk about it more later, but yeah, I imagine definitely one of the main abilities that she would be using in a fight like this. Alright, now let's just run through some of the smaller abilities that she has. She can use the senses of animals like eyesight or hearing as her own to spy and eavesdrop seemingly wherever she wants, as well as use animals or devils that she has control over as a means of teleportation, even into hell and back. She has been shown to have control over the Angel Devil, who can create very powerful swords made up of lifetimes that they've stolen from people. She can control the Spider Devil, the Snake Devil, the Punishment Devil, the Zombie Devil, and the 7 weapon hybrids. I know I'm not going into detail about any any of these, but there's a reason for that, and I'll explain their relevance when we get to the actual fight. She has an incredibly high intellect and is an expert manipulator outside of her powers. She can also use her powers at long distance ranges, being able to open up a portal above the gun devil for all of her devils to appear and attack from. Last but not least from Makima, we have her most broken ability, the ability that even makes her a part of this conversation in the first place. She has a contract with the Prime Minister of Japan that transfers any and all attacks or damage made on her to a random Japanese citizen, meaning that she is effectively immortal so long as there are any Japanese citizens alive. And with that, those are all of Makima's known abilities and feats, and now it should be clear why she's an absolute powerhouse in the Chainsaw Man world, being filled to the brim with busted abilities that make her seemingly unbeatable. On the other hand, we have Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses, the man who reigned supreme over all sorcerers back in the golden age of Jujutsu, the one they simply call a natural disaster, a calamity that cannot be stopped. So what exactly can this absolute monstrosity do? Allow me to explain. Let's start with Sukuna's physical stats. In Chapter 8, he's shown capable of easily destroying a bridge by simply stomping on it at 2 fingers worth of power, which is only about 10% of his power, since he has 20 fingers total. And in Chapter 9, with 3 fingers, punched Megumi through a building with ease. So I think it's pretty safe to say that a full 20-finger Sukuna can pretty casually take out large buildings with his bare hands alone. Not much else to say here, bro is just really fucking strong. Now for his speed. We see that pre-awakened Maki was able to react to and grab a bullet that has already been fired. Awakened Maki is several times faster than this naturally and is equal in speed to Toji. And we know from Megumi that a 3-finger Sukuna is comparable to Toji in speed. To be fair, Megumi is somewhat of an unreliable narrator here since he gets perception blitzed by both of them, so we wouldn't be able to tell who is faster truly, but I think it's fair to say that they're at least comparable. But either way, 20-finger Sukuna should definitely be faster than 3-finger Sukuna, and therefore Toji, by a pretty good margin. So at the bare minimum, Sukuna should be several times faster than bullets. And if you think the bullet feat is bullshit, I'm not going to argue about it, but I think it's pretty safe to say that either way, Sukuna is faster than Makima. Let's just be real here. Whether the bullet thing is accurate or not, or Gege was just fucking around and just decided to have Maki catch a bullet for no reason, and it wasn't actually supposed to be like a feat taken seriously, it doesn't really change anything. Sukuna is still one of the fastest in the series outside of like Gojo with his teleportation. I think it's pretty fucking fair to just say that Makima doesn't hold a candle, so his actual speed doesn't even really matter in this conversation, let's be honest. In hand-to-hand combat, Sukuna seems to be one of the absolute best in the verse. He's shown his superior skills many times, but to be fair, it is debatable whether his fighting skills are just that good, or if it's just his speed and strength that make it that good by default, if you get what I'm saying. But either way, he's very impressive in this category as well. Lastly for this segment, Sukuna's durability. He was hit by a 200% hollow purple and only lost his arms, and had a point-blank red shot on his face, and it only really burned his skin off. So I don't think I need to say that Sukuna's durability is insanely high. Putting this man down is one hell of a fucking task. So all in all, this man's physical stats is just off the charts. This man is an absolute fucking menace. But yeah, that's about it for this segment. Let's move on. Alright, now it's time to talk about Sukuna's actual abilities. Sukuna's main curse technique is Cleave and Dismantle. Dismantle is his go-to attack when he's cutting down fodder. Dismantle is a slashing attack that basically acts as an invisible knife made of cursed energy that cuts through, or attempts to cut through in some cases, whoever Sukuna wants it to. Cleave, on the other hand, can have its power level adjusted by Sukuna himself depending on the strength of the opponent he's facing. These attacks have different roles once he's casted his domain, but we'll get to that later. He can also use Cleave in a technique he calls Spider's Thread, where it takes the shape of a spiderweb and destroys the surrounding area. Sukuna has presumably the highest amount of cursed energy in the entire series, which basically means he can fight for a very long time, but he can still run himself dry of his power eventually. He also has a very high battle intellect, being shown to deduce his opponent's curse techniques very quickly on multiple occasions, as well as coming up with battle strategies on the fly that counter the specific opponents he's facing. Sukuna can also use reverse curse technique, and he's extremely proficient in that usage. RCT is, put simply, regeneration. In Sukuna's case, hyper regeneration. So not only does he have insane durability, he can heal from pretty much any injury you could possibly give him, including ripping out his heart. It is speculated that decapitation or complete destruction of the head is the only way to really kill him, as it's said in the story that RCT is controlled by the brain, and if you destroy it, RCT is impossible and the user dies. This next ability doesn't have much relevance in this fight, but I'll go ahead and throw it in anyway. Domain amplification is the process of coding oneself in their innate domain. This can be used to absorb the opponent's curse technique, preventing them from using it. This is best used against people whose curse techniques are mainly used for defense, but while domain amplification is active, the user is also prevented from using their own curse technique, so it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Alright, now let's talk about Sukuna's big move, his domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine. Malevolent Shrine can cover up to 200 meters in its range, though he can shrink it to any size that he pleases. And in case you didn't know, domain expansions always have a sure hit attack, meaning that there is an attack imbued inside of the domain that bypasses any defense and hits the opponent directly no matter what. Sukuna's domain sure hit attack is a relentless mixture of cleave and dismantle. Dismantle being used to destroy inanimate objects, while cleave is used to cut down anything with cursed energy. And by the way, I'll go ahead and mention this now. To make the fight fair, Makima will be granted some cursed energy so that she can see Jujutsu in the first place, and also so that Sukuna's attacks can properly work on her. Anyway, the attacks continue to slash over and over without stop until Sukuna's domain is over or collapses. The domain also has no barrier, so breaking the barrier to collapse the domain is not an option here. The only way to force Sukuna's domain closed is to deal a blow that damages him enough to the point that keeping his domain open with that damage is too much to handle, as we see in the Gojo vs Sukuna fight. Next up, we've got Sukuna's open ability. In the Shibuya incident arc, Sukuna used a mysterious ability where he opened some sort of black box which granted him access to a brand new curse technique that we'd never seen before. This technique hasn't been named, but I'll refer to it as the Fire Arrow. Sukuna's Fire Arrow technique is, you guessed it, an arrow made of fire, specifically fire made up of cursed energy. He flung the fire by molding it with his hands into a shape that could be flung like an arrow would in a bow. Although we don't know if this is the only application this technique can be used in, or if he can mold it into behaving differently as well. That is yet to be seen. This technique was strong enough to burn Jogo, the disaster cursed spirit of Earth, specifically volcanoes, to a crisp, killing him almost instantly. He also used it to finish off Maharaga in a single shot after weakening the Shikigami with his domain, which had already adapted to. In that instance, we see that the fire arrow produces a very large blast radius, engulfing a whole area in this extremely powerful flame. Lastly, we have Sukuna's latest addition to his arsenal of curse techniques, the 10 Shadows technique. I'll just quickly run through the abilities that this grants him. This ability grants him access to 10 different Shikigami, as well as the ability to slip in and out of any shadow that he's standing in, including his own. As for the Shikigami, first up we have the Divine Dog, a powerful, well-rounded Shikigami whose claws can slice through even special grade curses. Sukuna also seems to be able to split its power into multiple Divine Dogs, as we see in the Yorozu fight. Next is Nue. In Sukuna's hands, Nue becomes an owl-like Shikigami the size of a fucking building that can produce large blasts of electricity down on its victims. The Toad seems to be a fairly weak Shikigami, but who knows what it can do when Sukuna is the one in the driver's seat. Max Elephant is a big elephant Shikigami that can shoot out vast amount of water from its trunk and is also very heavy. Rabbit Escape is a huge swarm of rabbits that is mainly used as a sort of smoke screen to hide yourself in. Tranquil Deer can use reverse curse technique on the user or itself and also cancel out its opponent's curse techniques. Piercing Ox rams into the opponent relentlessly, but gets exponentially more powerful the longer the distance that it runs. It can also only run in a straight line. And last but not least, we have the 8-handled sword Divergent Sia Divine General Maharaga. This is the most powerful Shikigami we've ever seen. Its physical stats are high enough to both slightly damage and withstand attacks from a 15-finger Sukuna. It has a sword made up of positive energy that can one-shot pretty much any cursed spirit in the verse, and it's quite a large Shikigami as well. None of that is what makes it so strong though. Maharaga's main ability is described as being able to adapt to any and all phenomena. Basically, if you hit it with something and it doesn't die, it'll adapt to that attack, and that attack will be either rendered useless against it, or will just be really weak against it, making it impossible to kill it with that attack. It can also seem to adapt its own offensive abilities. For instance, after Sukuna dodged its attack, the wheel turned, meaning it adapted to something. Most people speculate that it adapted to Sukuna's speed here, but we can't be sure. Sukuna himself also says that Maharaga will be able to adapt to Gojo's Infinity Barrier, meaning that its adaptability also includes defenses that prevent it from attacking its opponent. And with that, we've pretty much covered all of Sukuna and Makima's abilities. Let's get to how this fight would play out, shall we? Okay, before we start, I want to preface this by saying that later in the fight, after I go through the basics and explain how most of the fight would play out, I'm going to be then separating it into 3 different scenarios. One for each of Sukuna's forms, because he has multiple throughout the series, all with different abilities and characteristics. It's going to be Makima versus Yuji Kuna, aka face Sukuna in Yuichi's body, Makima versus Meguna, Sukuna in Megumi's body, and then Makima versus Heian era Sukuna, Sukuna's original self over 1,000 years ago. But first, let's begin with the basic aspects of the fight that would apply to all three versions of Sukuna. As you heard from my descriptions of their powers, when speaking of physical stats, Makima cannot compete in the slightest. I dare say that without her revival contract, she'd just get blitzed in one shot, to be honest. Makima couldn't land so much as a single hit on any version of Sukuna, let's be real. Even with her teleportation ability, things wouldn't get much better. Gojo's teleportation is way more flexible and frequent than hers can be, and the gap in their physical abilities wouldn't even make it that useful of an ability. So Makima definitely does not want to make this a close quarters hand-to-hand fight. But okay, what about all the devils, fiends, hybrids, and hunters that she has control over? Surely they'd be able to do something with their vast numbers and array of abilities, right? Well, maybe. The only character that likely comes close to scaling to Sukuna in physicals is Pochita, and that's a maybe. And we see Pochita obliterate arguably some of the stronger people under her control, those being the weapon hybrids. So their durability, speed, strength, etc. is also just vastly inferior to Sukuna's as well. Sukuna could likely just use Cleave and Dismantle to pretty much take care of any devil, fiend, hybrid, whatever that she brings out. None of them would really have an effect. The zombie devil would get slice and dice along with the zombies. The snake devil wouldn't really do anything because it's probably not fast enough to hit Sukuna, and even if it did, it's probably not strong enough to even damage him. We haven't really seen what the punishment devil can do, but I think it's pretty safe to assume that it's not too much stronger than the rest. Well, let's just say he can. Let's say she brings them all out at once and there are just too many for him to handle. Well, at that point, he can just open up Malevolent Shrine, and they'll be taken care of all the same. None of them have any hyper regeneration or any ability that would help them survive Shrine's brutal onslaught of slashes, and Makima's army would crumble before her eyes. But Makima has abilities of her own. Let's see how those would fare. Makima's domination ability would fail, needless to say, because she has to beat somebody to take control over them. Let's move on. Makima's Shrine Sacrifice ability would likely fail, since we've established that it most likely does not work on people that aren't complete fodder. If this ever gets disproved in the future, then this fight would maybe look a bit different, but right now, I cannot look you in the eye and tell you that her Shrine ability would be able to just obliterate Sukuna. I just can't tell you that, I'm sorry. Her Force Manipulation ability would probably be able to damage Sukuna, but it is not an instant kill, neither does it completely incapacitate the brain or anything like that, as she uses it against the Darkness Devil, and it does not kill him, and he's able to recover from it pretty easily. So if the Darkness Devil can take the attack and heal from it, I think it's fair to say that Sukuna can as well, so we just use Reverse Curse Technique to heal from that ability and all would be good. She might start spamming it, but I don't really see that being a problem for Sukuna, so let's move on. Lastly, her Bang ability. I can also see this attack actually damaging Sukuna, but unfortunately, it wouldn't be blowing holes in his body or anything, as we see Pochita take multiple of these attacks with his body fully intact. And as I said before, Pochita scales the closest to Sukuna in physical stats, so if he can tank it, then Sukuna probably can as well. And I know I'm comparing Pochita to Sukuna a lot without giving any evidence in this video for that, and I do admit that it is a lot of guesswork, but to be fair, Chainsaw Man isn't really a series that goes heavily into speed and durability and all that stuff, so naturally I'm gonna have to do a lot of speculation. I'm just taking what I see and what I think would make the most sense if both worlds were to collide based on my rating of each series. So you can nitpick me all you want, but I really just can't see her Bang ability or any of those abilities actually like taking down Sukuna, doing massive damage to his body when it couldn't even do that to Pochita. If you really just think about it for a second, it kind of makes sense to scale them, at least in the same like realm of speed, durability, etc. And I might make a whole separate video on Pochita versus the Jujutsu Kaisen verse, so let me know if y'all want to see that. So yeah, anyway, Bang would probably damage Sukuna, but it wouldn't be blowing holes in his chest. He would recover from it easily, and not only can he pretty much tank it, any damage he does take can be healed instantly with Reverse Curse Technique. And if you're wondering if Bang could potentially do enough damage to collapse Sukuna's domain, I doubt it, because Gojo has to rip a hole in Sukuna's chest for that to happen, and we just established that Bang would probably not be capable of doing that. So with that, Sukuna has pretty much shut down all of Makima's abilities at this point, all of her offensive abilities at least. So her only win con at this point would be draining him of cursed energy. Her attacks and her physical stats or speed, blah blah blah, just cannot keep up, would not be able to do enough damage to actually put him on the back foot in any way, shape, or form. So that just leaves us with one single ability from Makima, the one that's allowing her to clean the life in such a one-sided fight: her endless revival contract. When the fight begins, Sukuna would likely just try to dismantle her and end her life in one fell swoop, and while it would work, she'd be cut in two, she'd just get right back up because of her contract with the Prime Minister of Japan, allowing her to mitigate all damage to a random Japanese citizen. I believe Sukuna would pick up on the fact that she wasn't using Reverse Curse Technique, but instead some other ability pretty fast. They'd probably have a few more rounds of Sukuna destroying her and her getting back up, before she'd realize that fighting him hand to hand is useless and she'd bring out her army. And we we already know how that would play out. The domain comes up and Makima is slashed to bits alongside her army. Shrine would leave Makima a pile of flesh on the ground, and Sukuna would probably close the domain after a while, but again, Makima would just regenerate and get back up. At this point, Sukuna would know that something's fishy, and he'd start considering his options. Here's where we split into the three versions of Sukuna, because all three of them have different options available of what they can do and how they can get around Makima's revival ability. Let's start with Yuji Kuna's options. Let's get the most obvious one out of the way. Some might be thinking, couldn't Sukuna just kill her over and over until every Japanese citizen is dead so her contract is void? Well, for Yuji Kuna, the answer is no. Why? Because Sukuna's vessel, Yuji Itadori, is a Japanese citizen himself, and by doing this, Sukuna would eventually start taking on the damage that he himself is trying to dish out on Makima. Now, Sukuna obviously wouldn't know about the contract and the specifics of it, but I'm going to be generous to him and say that he wouldn't be dumb enough to just try and kill her over and over and over with no plan other than, it'll work eventually, until the point where he just ends up killing himself on accident, right? Sukuna is very smart. He'd start coming up with actual plans after realizing that his regular means of killing are not effective. With that out of the way, it's time to discuss the methods that Yuji Kuna can actually use to put Makima down. Option 1. Consumption. The way that Denji himself gets rid of Makima in the Chainsaw Man story is by cooking and eating her sliced up body. Now, whether this worked because of a loophole in her contract, or if it worked because Denji ate her as an act of love, therefore it wasn't actually an attack, is unclear, as the story presents us with those two options and leaves the answer to the reader's own interpretation. With that being said, Sukuna is a confirmed cannibal, so him deciding to eat her cleaved bits isn't out of the question. Now again, this simply might not work, because we don't really know why Denji eating her worked in the first place. But it's definitely something to consider when talking about this particular matchup. The second and last of Yuji Kuna's options is his fire arrow technique. This technique was capable of burning up two very powerful entities in the JJK verse, both of which have better durability feats than Makima. I read somewhere that in the fanbook it states that Sukuna's fire arrow is so hot that it burns you down to your bone marrow pretty much instantly, but take that with a grain of salt because I did try to research it, but every version of the English translation of the fanbook that I found had pages missing, and I couldn't find the page that that person was talking about. It wasn't on the page about Sukuna, so I'm a bit confused on where they got that from, but that does ring a bell. I'm pretty sure I have seen that before other than that person talking about it, so I'm pretty sure it is a real page. If anybody knows about that page and can potentially like guide me to where I could find that in the comments, that would be great. But yeah, anyway, in my opinion, it isn't insane to think that Sukuna's fire arrow would just simply burn Makima into nothing, effectively disintegrating her, and if that happens, there wouldn't be any molecule left of her to regenerate from. Now, some of you might be thinking that both of these methods seem kind of weak. And don't worry, I agree. These win cons aren't really the strongest, neither have solid evidence that they would actually even work, and Makima has a pretty solid win con herself. If neither of these end up working, she simply has to wait until Sukuna runs himself dry of cursed energy, then spams bang at him until he perishes. But this is only the case for Yuji Kuna. Meguna and Heianera Sukuna have more options up their sleeve. Let's move on to Meguna. Meguna has the same first two options as Yuji Kuna does, those being potentially consumption and potentially the fire arrow, but he has a third as well, one that's a lot stronger of an argument. Meguna has the option to bring out the Divine General Maharaga. Maharaga's ability to adapt to any and all phenomena would be a pretty simple and easy way to bypass Makima's contract. Maharaga would attack her, she'd revive, and since she isn't using reverse curse technique to heal herself, it would be something that Maharaga would likely be able to adapt to. In chapter 230, it's confirmed that Maharaga would be able to adapt to Gojo's neutral limitless, so Maharaga is indeed capable of changing its offensive tactics if at first it fails. With all this in mind, I think Sukuna in Megami's body beats Makima fairly easily in all honesty. There's pretty much nothing Makima can do to hurt Sukuna or stop Maharaga from killing her, because even if you think one of her attacks could somehow kill Maharaga in one attack, Sukuna could just instead wear the wheel himself and have Maharaga adapt while still being safe in the shadows. But what about the original Ryomen Sukuna, the one that lived back in the Heian era of Japan, reigning supreme over the world of Jujutsu sorcery? Well, while it's true that he doesn't have access to Maharaga like Meguna does, that doesn't mean he has the same options as Yuji Kuna. Again, the first two options remain there, but if you need more convincing, here's a third that we can apply only to Heian era Sukuna. And before you think it, no, I am not talking about Sukuna's cursed tools or his four arms, or the potential other curse techniques that he probably has with his open ability. We don't know how any of those work, so I'm not going to even mention those in this video. Remember how I said that killing her until every Japanese citizen was dead was implausible because Sukuna's vessels were citizens as well? So that option kinda isn't as implausible with Heian Sukuna. Why? because citizenship didn't become a thing in Japan until the late 1800s, which is hundreds of years after the Heian era, meaning that Sukuna is not a Japanese citizen himself, and he could indeed kill Makima 125 million times, which is the population of Japan currently, nullifying her contract without ever having to worry about the damage being transferred to himself. Now, 125 million is a big number. Could Sukuna do that without running out of cursed energy? Personally, I believe he can, for a few reasons. Cleave and Dismantle is an ability that would be extremely effective in this scenario, as one cleave is all it would take to cut her head off and kill her once, and that wouldn't take much cursed energy at all. And we also know that Sukuna is the most efficient user of cursed energy outside of the 6 eyes, which basically means his attacks take up very little of his cursed energy when he uses them. And of course, if he does start to run out of cursed energy, he could always just, I don't know, slice her up and keep her trapped somewhere, where he could just kill her whenever he felt like it until she died for good. I don't know. It's a weird situation for sure, but I think he could pull off the 125 million kills because Makima realistically has no way to stop him from doing so. Sukuna would be aware when he starts to run out of cursed energy. And I know I said earlier that Sukuna wouldn't be dumb enough to just try and kill her over and over and over and over again, but I'm saying with Heian era Sukuna, he could do that if he wanted to, and if he was dumb enough to do that, it would actually work. And let's be real here. If Sukuna was doing this and ran out of cursed energy, even if they were trapped in like some kind of arena where they couldn't escape until one died, Sukuna could just run away from her until his cursed energy replenished. Let's be real here, even without cursed energy, Sukuna would probably just be way faster than Makima in general, especially with his Heian era form where he's super buff with 4 arms and shit. Me personally, I think the Fire Arrow would probably just completely get rid of her, but I know a lot of people probably disagree, simply because we don't know the specifics of her contract, and she might be able to just revive even if there's literally 0 molecules of her left, who knows. Honestly, any matchup with Makima in it is very weird because of this contract, but I think Sukuna probably would be one of the better people to deal with it, because, you know, Meguna has Maharaga, Heian era Sukuna isn't a citizen, he has the Fire Arrow, which probably could just disintegrate all her molecules, he could try eating her, blah blah blah. So in conclusion, Yuji Kuna may or may not be able to put Makima down depending on how you think her contract works, but both Meguna and Heian era Sukuna wouldn't really have any issues taking care of the Horsemen of Conquest, besides maybe some boredom and tediousness for Heian era Sukuna. So that's why, based on the evidence presented that I have gathered from each character's respective stories, I believe that Sukuna versus Makima is not close. But even if you think that Heian Sukuna couldn't kill her 125 million times before she killed him, and that Yuji Kuna's options wouldn't work either, I can still confidently say that Meguna would have no problem taking down Sukuna, so I can still say that this matchup is not close. Get fucked. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I love each and every one of you. If you enjoyed, make sure to like the video and hit that subscribe button, and comment down below how you think this fight would play out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.